refusal haunts the entire history of technology.
When we refuse a technology, it's part of this legacy.
There's an overwhelming sense that today we cannot refuse. And you show historically we've always been refusing.
Hello, everyone. I'm Thomas de Keyser. I'm a lecturer in human geography at the University of Southampton. I'm also the author of the book Techno-Negative, A Long History of Refusing the Machine, which is published with University of Minnesota Press. I'm happy to be joined today by Sarah Sharma and Brian Merchant, both thinkers who I greatly admire and who have been influential in shaping contemporary debates about technological politics, as well as debates around the possibilities of refusal. Today, we're going to be talking about the book, but also more generally about long histories of resistance to technology, the Luddites potentially, refusal of AI technologies, and the politics of technology more generally. I'll start with a brief kind of recap summary of the book. So my book, Techno-Negative, traces the long histories of technological refusal. I start in ancient Greece with some of the first machine breakers and end with ultra-leftist groups bombing computer companies in 1980s France. When we look through such archives, what we find is that more often than not, when new technologies are being developed and distributed, there are pockets of refusal that aim to undo those technologies. Refusal haunts the entire history of technology. So the book investigates the shifting terrain of this refusal throughout history, following its various political trajectories, philosophical commitments, and material practices. And what I noticed going through these histories is that the play between innovation and refusal is actually rarely limited to the kind of practical and economic concerns that we often tend to think about when we think about technology, such as will it make our lives easier? Will it make us more productive? And so on. And instead, it often plays out on the level of kind of shaping and reshaping who and what counts as human. So the book traces how, within various contexts, technology is tied up with this ongoing definition and redefinition of what it means to be human, and how this has long legitimized various forms of exclusion and violence. Through this focus, I reveal the need to move away from debates that understand technological power as largely a question of harms, biases, and rights, although those are, of course, important. And instead, I begin to foreground the politics of these kinds of ontological determinations. So the question that the book ends with is this: in our moment of the ever closer alignment of big tech and Silicon Valley and elsewhere with authoritarian politics, how are we to resist? So the aim of the book is to offer some historical and conceptual tools for resisting these kinds of technological environments that are increasingly saturating our everyday working and social lives. So that was a brief summary of the book. What I want to do now is give a chance to both Sarah and Brian to introduce themselves before then leading us into a conversation about the themes at the heart of the book.
I'm Sarah Sharma. I'm professor of media theory at the University of Toronto at the Institute for Communication, Culture, Information and Technology, where I'm also the director. I'm the author of Insufferable Tools, Feminism Against Big Tech. First, I should say, I feel it's a companion piece to Thomas's book from a feminist perspective, so I'm very excited about their emergence in the world together. But one of my arguments in the book is that it appears as though our big tech giants have a media theory, and that the way they conceive of technology is the same as the way they conceive of difference. In other words, they have the same conception of technology as a utility, and they conceive of others and people in the world as utility. And they create a conception of technology as tools that we all sort of fall for, but they don't think of technologies as tools. They, in fact, think of technologies as environments. And one of my concerns has been that the feminist turn to technology sort of lacks a media theory. I think, like Thomas, some of these things are hard to say. Some of these things feel difficult to say about the worlds in which we work within.
Hello, yes, and I'm Brian Merchant. I am an author and writer who covers AI, tech, and the labor space. I'm a journalist by training and the author of the book Blood in the Machine about the Luddites, who I imagine we'll be discussing today, perhaps the most famous techno-negativists. Thomas, we can debate whether or not that's the case. Certainly the one bound most ferociously with the epithet that equates to that in popular culture. I am looking forward to discussing this fine book and any number of other myriad of topics that it may inspire us to get onto.
I can start. I got to read an earlier copy of your book, and one of the first things, and it's the thing I just said actually, was how difficult and brave I found the book to be. It's brilliant. It's page turning. It does this counter history of refusal that allows, I think, so many other scholars to do the work they do. I always love it when this happens. It's like, thank you for doing this so we can do this. It is really difficult to argue against the techno-reformist position. And I wanted to ask you how it feels to do that. I mean, we can intellectualize this, we can talk about theories and histories, but I actually want to talk about you as a scholar, writer, arguing against something like Reformation.
This is a great question. I think you're absolutely right. It is a difficult position to inhabit. And one of the main impulses behind the book is precisely my kind of dissatisfaction with that position, in that I feel like it often comes short in terms of actually articulating alternative futures, or even just sort of offering a significant counterpoint to our contemporary moment, which seems to be increasingly authoritarian. And within that, it seems like reformism is it's just a shortcoming for various reasons. But I think that said, it does remain a kind of difficult task to even try and think something that exists outside of reformism. Some of the figures that I draw upon the book have stood out to me precisely because they embody that position that I couldn't quite articulate myself, precisely because it seems like we're at a moment where reformism is taken as the foundation for pretty much all articulation of technological politics on the left. And so it's either reformism or accelerationism. I've long been drawn to a more kind of abolitionist position. So I think that's where I find some comfort in taking on a position that isn't a reformist one, is looking at other fields of struggle, whether it's around race, gender, and so on, and seeing that within that people have productively and successfully taken up positions that are other than reformist. So I think I agree there's a kind of difficulty in taking on that position, but I find comfort in sort of companion thinkers in other parts of politics. And I find it interesting to bring that into the sphere of technological politics and thinking about what a kind of more abolitionist position might look like. And it's also something that I read in your work, the manifesto that you wrote around broken machines. I take inspiration from that because you're one of the few people that also seems to inhabit a sort of similar sentiment, very least, that is trying to exceed or circumvent kind of the problems that come with more reformist positions.
Yeah. And I find myself, to be generous, I would say, like, I say to people that take up like this question of like, well, what then instead, or what can we do? And I think of what you've offered. First of all, you actually locate the counter histories. I mean, you actually have the figures of refusal. You've proven it historically. And I think for me, I'm not doing a history, but I can only say I want it to be an orientation. Like that abolition, refusal, at least in my world of media studies, should be an orientation. I was thinking too about how when you talk about techno-onticide or technological onticide in the history of colonialism, I mean, the proof is there. You offer a paradigm and framework for actually understanding the violence in the position of Reformation when you bring up the history of colonialism is a history of technology and a history of refusal as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it does lead to an interesting question. What I think this alternative politics would entail, I think, is a big open question right now for people sort of seeking to practice this. And, calling it abolition, which I've seen floated in a lot of spaces, is often also fraught for reasons sort of gestured at by what you were just talking about, Sarah. So I'm wondering how you conceive of. It's one thing to refuse, and I understand the drive to try to condemn or to separate from reformism, but things do get thorny, and when we're calling this abolition or something like abolition, that immediately sort of conjures a whole new set of politics that need to be interrogated. So I'm wondering, how you're thinking about that. Like, are you thinking about this as sort of a technological abolition or AI abolition, or how are you navigating this space? As you said, like, what then, right? Or what does come next?
I think that's a very interesting and big question. I think the way I articulate the position of abolitionism, or the techno-abolitionist position that I'm beginning to sketch out in the book, and it's only really in the conclusion that I come to it specifically, I articulate abolitionism in terms of a very specific kind of ontological and political problem that I've sort of traced throughout the history of technological refusal, which is that problem of kind of humanism that comes back again and again, and that has a variety of very violent implications, whereby certain humans, as Sarah mentioned, sort of colonial context, wherein technology is sort of used as a discursive tool for rendering certain people as either lesser human or less than human. And so that's one case in which the humanist politics is revealed to be profoundly kind of violent in various ways. And so my abolitionist position that I'm articulating in the book, I'm particularly towards the end, is an abolition of a humanist position to technology. So it's less a articulation of a specific material practice of, say, we need to go and destroy our technological environments. I think I would be very wary of that, in fact, of that position, because it assumes that we can easily separate ourselves from those systems to begin with, which we cannot. And I think the reason why I'm drawn to a critique of humanism is that it's a way of beginning to kind of undermine those kinds of imaginations that are either technology can just simply be mastered by the human in ways that are desirable to us, or on the other hand, we can just rid ourselves of technology as if technology was ever sort of separate from us. So the abolitionist position is, for me, one which starts from a kind of critique of a humanist politics of technology. In the very end, I go back to some of the techno-negative figures that I talk about in the book and sort of begin to map out some positions that I think are abolitionists. So I'm looking at sort of an inhumanist politics of technology, non-human politics of technology. I'm trying to map various ways of thinking technology beyond a humanism that I think engenders all kinds of violence. I want to be precise in terms of what I mean by abolitionism, and it has to do with an abolition of sort of a humanist position. And then what comes after that, I'm hoping other people will continue to build upon, but also I'll hopefully continue to explore my own work.
Yeah. Since you kind of mentioned this was one thing that I found very interesting, which was like an argument in the introduction about how you're structuring your thinking around what techno negativism is. And I will quote you back to yourself. I know authors love it when people do that. You're defining techno negativism. You're saying, like, this is not the cruel optimism described by Lauren Berlant, where one holds an attachment to what is ultimately averse to your flourishing, but it's inversion, a disbelief in what holds the conditions of one's ability to live on. Data, the applications, the algorithms, the cloud storage, the mobile devices, and the wearables we might disdain are the same ones that, in empowering much of our personal, social, and working lives, constitute us. I thought that this was a really interesting claim to make on a lot of levels. So one question I had is, like, you're ceding quite a bit to the sort of the tech companies and their operators. Sure, we've entered into contracts with them, how we use their platforms and services and generate this kind of data you're talking to, and what we get and give up in return. But we've entered into those contracts a lot of times against our will, or we're not even knowledgeable, or a lot of users aren't knowledgeable in them. I think some would argue that the notion that the data these companies have gathered and the infrastructures they've built, they might argue against the idea that this constitutes us, and that it may in fact be rejected without rejecting that which holds the conditions of our ability to live on. Like, to me, alternative arrangements with perhaps differently constituted managers of infrastructure, more democratically, more humanistically managed infrastructure and services are kind of imaginable. So, not to get like so deep into the weeds early on, but I was really curious about this claim that this stuff constitutes us. It seemed to me to be a powerful and very interesting claim.
Can we play a game? Because I had this quote exactly out to ask you a similar question from a completely different framework. So I have to do this now. And I was going to tell you this really grabbed me, this quote about our everyday devices that organize the way we move in the world. And I was going to suggest that this is really part of a recursive media theory where you recognize that what's happening here is these are the technologies that structure our relations with one another, how we move, our proximity. So I hear Brian coming at this from more of a political economic standpoint. We enter these contracts with these tech companies and we can reject them. We can say no on the paper. And then I see this world, the data, the applications, the algorithms, the storage, the mobile devices, the wearables are the same ones that empower personal, social, and working lives as sort of like the very things that propel us in the world to make us who we are. And they're so mundane and innocuous that we don't recognize them as really powerful technologies. I was thinking about, yes, and this structure is what it means to be properly human. And it's also why it's difficult for people to think of something like refusal or negativity because this is the condition of their possibility. And it would make me think that something like abolition, refusal also needs to recognize its technological parameters of possibility. We don't refuse in a non media environment, we refuse in a media environment. So, my question for you, Thomas, is who is right, Brian or I?
You're both right. I'm glad you picked up on that quote because I think it sets the central problem that I'm trying to work through in the book, which is precisely the challenge of refusal at a time when these technological environments, if not actually constitute us, seem like they constitute us to the point that it's really hard to imagine our social relationships, for example, without advanced technological mediation. It's really hard to imagine our everyday working lives without reliance on internet infrastructures. So I think that sets up a difficult challenge for the imagination. For me, that is not a giving in to technological power, but a recognition of the conditions that they've created for us. For me, it props up the challenge of refusal, the very difficulty of it, not as a way of saying that refusal is impossible, but that we have to start from that our own enmeshedness, our embeddedness within these technological infrastructures. For me, a reformism doesn't get out of the violent dimensions of these technological environments. And a part of the difficulty is thinking outside of the structures that I do think constitute us, even if it's against our own will. For me, it isn't a way of setting up the impossibility of refusal, but of the very stakes of refusal.
Yeah, it's an interesting place to jump off and explore, what follows from that, as so many arguments follow from that in your book. I am thinking of a lot of the folks I've encountered in some of my recent writing and reporting, groups that are engaging in a techno-negativism, and in some cases what they are calling Luddism, especially the student groups who have begun organizing events and chapters and groups and movements to disavow the phone, especially getting rid of the phone, getting rid of the iPads. They hold up the iPad babies as like growing up in tandem with all these extractive and attention dominating technologies that are owned by the big tech companies, and that they feel victimized in culture and in their upbringings. And so there is a practice now among, like, I'm thinking of the Luddite Club in New York City, the Lamp Club, there's abstinence, and some of these have varying degrees of grassroots resonance. Some of them just very much are high school kids or college kids who have said, this is what we're going to do, we're just going to get rid of the phone, we're going to pull the plug. So that is, to me, is kind of an option on the table. And interestingly, I'll just add, I think the effect of talking to all these groups and these young people who are trying to refuse technology in a society that has integrated all these norms that you're talking about, all of the, the wearables and data ingestion and so forth, has had the sort of the social effect of expanding the possible for me personally. I've been looking at getting a dumb phone or a light phone, or if not, just like smashing my iPhone outright. This is a long-winded way of saying these kids have decided that they are not defined by the data, that does not constitute them, that they can leave it behind, and we'll see how effectively and for how long. But does that option still exist in your framework and in your conception to say, like, well, this is me and this is not?
Yeah, I think it's precisely, I want to make room for, and I do this in the book historically, I want to make room for precisely those moments when people have decided that those are possibilities, both in terms of individual or collective forms of refusal. What I'm setting up is the profound difficulty of doing that. The people that I've spoken that are involved with those kinds of practices today, one of the things that they will say again and again is the difficulty of it, whether it's in the form of, let's say, a detox movement, which will always already imply a return to, not detox, but the intoxication of whatever addictions, digital addictions that they have. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that's precisely the room that I'm trying to make by foregrounding the difficulty of it and the need to take it seriously as something that I think is increasingly harder. So when I make the claim in the introduction, I'm specifically talking about our contemporary moment. And if we compare that to some of the historical examples that I discuss in the book, whether it's the Luddites or religious communities in medieval times, it's quite different when we think about the possibilities of refusal in those moments versus our contemporary moments. And I think that's what I'm trying to do in the introduction, is to set up the contemporary difficulty of it. If we're thinking about the Luddites, and Brian, you've written about this in depth, if we're thinking about the Luddites, there's a particular set of machines that they're rejecting for a particular set of reasons. I think our contemporary moment, even if we're just looking at computation, it's so omnipresent that it is incredibly hard to think outside of anything but, okay, we can just keep what we have and do it slightly better, reform it in slightly more humane ways, for example. I guess that's where I'm trying to go with this, is to try and set up the contemporary moment and the difficulty of it in order to then push through it, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think what's so valuable about the book, which is this is such a rich and invaluable text for so many reasons, and one of which is that the way that it historicizes this rejection, and that's another really key point I think you make in the introduction, is that this is missing from our histories, this is missing from our culture, this is missing from the narrative in general, and having it absent from history, all of these refusals, whether organized or, I love the story of Archimedes in ancient Greece, and just tracing this through, that there is this through line that has been ignored. My impulse before reading this book would have been to say, like, well, that's because the dictates of capital are driving, the erasure of the narratives of refusal from history, because that's what it wants. It doesn't want resistance or any criticality, but it precedes that even. I think that, like, knowing that it is human, knowing that there is, in some cases, nobility and mythology around refusal, and accentuating this fact will do wonders for building up this sense that when we refuse a technology, it's not just for material purposes. It often is, but it's part of this legacy just as much as innovation. It's such a hollow sort of single point cultural conception of technological development that we have, where we just sort of hail the innovators who end up making a lot of money from a technology and omit the refusal. So I did want to say thank you for filling out this history and giving it such depth and breadth. And I think that it'll be inspiring and useful and interesting to a lot of people.
I second that. Thank you, and say it again. It's interesting to me. I think this is one of your arguments too, because of how you do your histories. There's an overwhelming sense that today we cannot refuse. And, you show historically we've always been refusing. And the idea that today technology is so pervasive in every domain that we can't step outside in any way. But I also think you do hold on to an idea that we live in the world of the tech, whether or not we are using it. And I think that's central to your history. It's something I think you and I share in our work. I like the way you do this, because you bring up the individuals that are doing this, but at the same time, like Brian's bringing up like something like abstinence or people getting rid of their phones. And these are great for digital detox. These are great for small groups. These are great, but does it change the world they live in? If we can say technological power is a form of power, like if technological power is as strong as economic power, social, other forms of power, if we recognize technology as being not a tool, but a type of power, then I think it changes the game for what refusal looks like in this context.
Yeah, Sarah, what you're describing, I think that's absolutely right. We need to think of technology beyond the material infrastructures and devices and even the coding, the algorithms, and so on. And instead to think about it as a set of environments that are produced technologically that moves beyond just the devices that we use and how we use them. It's a way of sort of the computational mind that digital technologies have helped produce far exceeds the question of whatever particular biases that exist within certain data sets and how that reproduces, let's say, certain forms of violence. Even though that's important, I think what big tech specifically has managed to do is to shape more than just the very immediate material ways that, let's say, we relate to each other, or even how the economy operates. And this is why I'm interested in the question of ontology in the book. I propose thinking of technological power as at least one important part of it is that it shapes and reshapes how we think what is human, what counts as human, what doesn't count as human. So I think if we're thinking about technological power as exceeding just whatever the particular devices that we use, a big part of that is the way that technology makes a sort of philosophical intervention. We see this historically and we see this today, whether it's in terms of AI reshaping what it means to be human, machines being thought of as human. These are all kinds of negotiations that are taking place, and they're profoundly political negotiations. This is what I'm tracing throughout history as well. The political struggle over what it means to be human as being, profoundly political. And I think our contemporary moment is just a sort of a new iteration of that and a new sort of acceleration of it.
I think it's great that it took us 32 minutes to use the word AI, say AI. So I want to congratulate us on that too. It's also funny for me, now that we're doing it, let's do it a little bit. It is interesting how the word human is invoked now and it sounds different than it did last year. Like, I'm not even talking about post-humanism or transhumanism. I'm talking about the way that our tech companies, our institutions, our universities use the word now. And when they say it, it creeps me out because I'm like, wait, what were we doing before? Exactly. It just doesn't sound the same. I'm not making a liberal humanist critique or anything. I'm not critiquing where does the human end, where does it begin and end. I'm not talking about the Cyborg Manifesto. I'm literally talking about the way the word sounds now.
Yeah, no, I agree. It risks becoming commoditized, even where firms are using AI and human vis-a-vis AI rather as a selling point, as like some positioning of like the human as a service provider in opposition to the AI generated sludge that's taking over everything else. And maybe this is one of the manifestations of the reformism that you're talking about. It's like a very neoliberal brand of reformism to say like, well, we'll use human made in our marketing materials. And I wrote a little article about this for The Atlantic last year. And the companies were just like, Dove was like, we will never use AI. We will always feature a human service guaranteed, or made by, there's like even a little logo some online boutique businesses are using, made by humans. And I think that also sheds light on the enormity of what refusal can entail now that AI, which is as much an ideological fixture as it is a technological one, is everywhere, is used in everything. The joke of the last couple of years has been everybody needs an AI strategy now, whether you're like a shoe manufacturer or like the Department of Education. Like AI is embedded everywhere. And therefore, the opportunity for refusal or rejection is arguably more omnipresent than it ever has been before.
Yeah, it's a good question. First, I want to actually go back to I think you're both right in terms of the mere term, the human, and how that's being invoked in order to suggest a sort of counterbalancing to whatever AI is doing is incredibly interesting to me. It assumes that the human who was previously enrolled in processes that are now automated, that those humans were doing things by default in ethically positive or very least ethically neutral ways, which is obviously not the case. Like we need to be very wary of setting up the binary between human and the machine for philosophical reasons, but also for profoundly political reasons. The machine isn't necessarily the evil that is the sort of counterposition to the good human. There's plenty of humans, and we just need to look at history to see that plenty of humans who've done all sorts of violent things, horrendous things, without machines helping them. So that's one thing I wanted to say on that. The second thing is also that centering of the human, positive balance to the machine, AI led or otherwise. I think there is a question of who counts as human within that. I think a purposeful ignoring of the humans that are rendered sort of less than human in the process of very least even just training data sets, labeling what happens to certain humans, who are those who are just considered the surplus of all this, who are the populations that are made to live in really dehumanizing environments, dehumanizing workplaces, and so on. So I think when we're thinking about that, the sort of value that gets put on the human, I'm always immediately thinking which human, and particularly when it comes to AI, what kinds of human are rendered less than human, even just on the sort of level of the training, the maintenance, the production of, and the waste that comes with artificial intelligence. I'm really happy with the comment around the human, because I think it really gets at the crux of what I'm trying to do in the book and sort of leverages it to contemporary moments where we see it sort of play out in very interesting ways.
Yeah, I think I want to say to praise you for that too. I think it's a really difficult position to parse out, and you're entering into like sort of a minefield too when you're talking about entering into feminist, post-colonial critical race approaches, transhumanist. Like it's very, very difficult. And I noticed that too when you were dealing with the Cyborg Manifesto, right, which is formative for the way feminist approaches to technology and the body expand. And I wanted to ask you, did you feel tentative about making that argument? And then I wanted to ask you, what other sorts of threads did you feel tentative about?
You're right. And I think there's a difficulty to it. And I think the way that I try and deal with it in the book is through precision. At least I'm hoping for conceptual precision. In many ways, it's not a rejection of many fields of thoughts. It's a way of hopefully revealing elements that have been forgotten or overlooked. And I think particularly when it comes to things like positions taken within sort of histories of feminist thought, Black studies, and so on. I think particularly there, it's even more significant to be as precise as possible in terms of what it is that one is trying to push forwards. My sort of pushing of certain strands of feminist thought and certain kinds of thought within particularly Black studies, I think is where I found that to be tricky isn't the right word, but where I felt most inclined to be as absolutely as precise as I possibly can be. I'm never really interested in an immediate rejection of any field of thought. I try, at least in my work, to always start from a generous position and work with what people are trying to do in order to then maybe go my own way.
If it's okay, I want to read your section. It's somewhere on page 70 in the earlier drafts. And I think you do this, and I want to just show everybody how careful you are with this. Quote, without a confrontation with the negative ontological labor of technology, we will fail to acknowledge and work through the specific technological dimensions of past colonial expansion. We also run the risk of overlooking and thereby failing to understand and undermine the contemporary violence of technological onticide, where racialized populations continue to be much more likely to be treated as machines, waste, or data. From this viewpoint, and as a conclusion we'll return to, neither a liberal humanist theory of man nor a post-humanist theory of subjectivity are currently capable of sufficiently working through and against the full scale of the ontological violence of colonialism. I just thought it was like one of the most powerful parts of your book this is that careful element I was thinking of. I thought it was fantastic.
What about something that's less careful? I'm wondering, this is not your most targeted audience or whatnot, but these days I go into rooms and I talk about AI and I talk about refusal a lot of times, especially from a standpoint of labor organizing and what it would mean to refuse in a contract or to oppose the introduction of a technology in a workplace. If a lot of workplaces are trying to do the top-down AI implementation thing, and so this is what I hear is, like, how do we oppose this? How do we fight back? How do we bargain? And I know this is not, you're concerned with philosophical inquiry and humanism and the broader picture, but I'm wondering also if in that inquiry it has surfaced any sort of recurring themes or thoughts or ideas that you might pass on to people who say, okay, you've surveyed the long and beautiful history of people and individuals and organizations, refusing or being negative about technology. What can that mean for us as we're sitting down trying to negotiate a labor contract with a boss that wants to use AI to automate X number of jobs or so on?
I think coming in with the big questions.
Yeah.
I think, ultimately, that's the question the book ends with more than directly responds to. I think the sort of philosophical arguments I make are a way into that without necessarily wanting to specify what exactly that should look like in the present. For me, that's a conscious choice. I think what I'm trying to offer are more conceptual tools that people can work with. That said, if I were to write this book in a different way, more, let's say, write another history of technological refusal, which I'm not going to do. But if I were to write another one with an eye specifically on pulling out what we might learn in terms of, let's say, practical organizing, I mean, there's a few things that I can think of. One is, and labor organizing is already moving in that direction, is the necessity of collectivity. If we're looking at that history, the power that comes with collective agency, I think, is a crucial one. I don't think that's a particularly surprising one, but at the very least, it pushes against a sort of very individualizing notion of technopolitics, which might be, I'm going to just stop using my phone and hope that that undermines our current technological regimes. I think by being in the place of labor, you've already partially asked the question of like what it might look like. And I think maybe a second thing that I would say is that it's about more than just using certain technologies or refusing certain technologies. And it's about a deeper, in order to refuse, we have to rethink more than which devices we use. It's an epistemological question. It's a question of how we relate to others. It's a deeper set of questions than just what do we use? What do we decide not to use? And I think that makes it really difficult because it means we have to alter our own subjectivities significantly if we are going to pose a serious threat to our contemporary sort of technological powers. And that makes it really difficult, I think. But I do think it's the necessary task, because otherwise we're just going to keep reproducing the same problems.
Yeah. That's why I was interested to sort of bring up the new Luddite clubs and people who are not just rejecting the technology or just, putting forward, but also like building like clubs and groups that can then sort of socialize that rejection in some way. Thank you for that.
If that's okay, I want to ask Sarah actually how you would respond to that question, given your new book coming out as a sort of feminist critique of big tech. And I don't know if part of that is thinking through feminist ways of resisting or feminist modes of doing and thinking and making technology. I don't know if that's a part of it, but I'm also curious as to how you would respond to that potentially.
Yeah, I feel like I wrote it in a way so I couldn't get asked that question Brian just asked because I know that everybody wants to ask that question, but it still comes up. Even in the book, I was like, I feel like I present as a clearing so that we can get to that part.
That's what all you academics do. You all are like, we make the theory. I lead.
You know what? We're paving the way for Brian to exist. That's what we're doing. Don't you think, Thomas? We are the condition for your possibility, Brian.
It puts a lot of pressure on me.
No, I'm kidding.
No,
But
I'm just
I'm
kidding.
not exactly kidding. It's like a division of labor. We all have to hit. This is one thing I love about talking to you two is we're doing different things. We can't each do that thing, and it's necessary. I think I'm taking up like where do we locate gender in the politics of big tech, right? And there's no obvious space or place, and it's not the place we're looking. One of my arguments is that feminist positions on technology spend so much time on the issue of reformation and repair because of the condition of our labor, right? We have to deal with this patriarchal technologic, and we spend so much time in it that we never get to the part of imagining otherwise. And I don't think like just imagining otherwise is an effective politics either, right? Like I'm not talking about other world making and something that's just going to arise, but we never get to the part of devising a feminist technologic because we're trying to deal with the patriarchal technologic. Part of doing that for me is that I really think that we need a feminist philosophy of technology. And I don't think reformation is a feminist philosophy of technology. I think that's a way of trying to repair and ameliorate the pain and violence of living under the patriarchal technologic. I define the patriarchal technologic as like homo and heteronormative economies of exchange, senses of the self that revolve around productivity, time management, the nuclear family, technologies of delegation over assistance. And so I'm like interrogating like these dominant structures and frameworks that when you mentioned this part about the apps and the mobile devices that we hold close to our bodies, I'm suggesting these are patriarchal technologies because they're technologies of delegation that depend on the utility of others. They only work in relationship to you delegate and you depend upon others' utility. And so what would a world of feminist technologics look like? And it's not about like, would life be better on another planet? It's part of the disdain and discomfort and what I call like an impasse in thinking about technology. We're kind of so confined in this patriarchal technologic. So when somebody asks me, which they always do, it's always the last question after a talk, when I've already stated in the beginning that I do not know what to do, and somebody asks me what to do, um, I'm usually tired and I don't know what to say, and I hopelessly fail in my response to that question.
Yeah, I can echo that. I think part of the reason why I set the book up in the way I do around specifically the kind of philosophical problem is precisely to, I think the question, what is to be done, is a crucial question. But I think before we get to that question, as I like the way you're putting it, Sarah, in terms of like clearing, I think that is entirely important work. And maybe just writing an academic book isn't precisely the way at getting at what is to be done. And it might be through practice, it might be through organizing. So I think there's sometimes it can be unfair to ask of someone who wrote a book what is to be done at the end. I understand the impulse, and I think it's an important one because people want answers to a difficult question like that. But I think that's kind of work to be done by myself as well as others. Like I wouldn't want to like offer a clear answer to that. Let's set up an abolitionist tech club. I mean, maybe that's the answer, but I think that's collective work.
But it's also this kind of writing and thinking we have to see as collective work. One of my arguments too is I believe that techno negativity on the ground, like labor organizers and whatnot, need feminist theory. They need a feminist approach. They need to think not just about women and others, like in terms of identity, but like orientation towards alternative technologic. I think it's amazing that there's an emergence of family abolition, police abolition. There's a whole bunch of refusal, blood in the machine. These things are emerging at a similar time. There is a structure, a feeling around the topic, and this is a division of labor. We can't do this all at once. But one of my arguments in the book is that we need to be able to see something like the Uber Eats driver needs to be able to identify with wages against housework. They need to be able to see themselves as part of the socially reproductive order, not just an entrepreneurial, hustling male. They need to be able to see themselves within the frameworks of feminist thought and action, but that's like an impasse. And, labor organizing is based on theory, but which theory? I think that's another way to think about this as well.
I have very much enjoyed putting you both on the spot here. Great answers and great thoughts.
Brian, if I could just, when somebody asks me that question in a talk and I've never done it, but I could be like, what a patriarchal question. What is to be done?
You could.
But I have never, and I will never.
Well, I was asking Thomas anyway.
Yes, anyways.
Sorry for passing it on to you, Sarah.
No.
I'm just always curious because I tend to deflect the question. I'm curious as to how other people respond to it. And it's a question I often get. I made a film that came out a few years ago called Machines and Flames, which focuses on a specific group that I also discussed in the book, which is called CLODO, which it's French acronym for Committee for the Liquidation or Subversion of Computers. It's a group that set fire to early computational companies like IBM, Philips Data Systems, and others. When I screened this film, at the end, people are like, what can we learn for our contemporary moment? And I'm like, I don't know, ask CLODO. We don't know who they are, but I think it's a really interesting impulse. And I think it comes in part from the urgency that we all feel I think the question always comes from a good place, which is, this is a particularly dire situation that we are in. What kind of tools can we come up with in order to break out of it? It's an important question, but it's a difficult one to answer without immediately reproducing certain kinds of problems.
All that, it's a beautiful film.
Yes, we screened it in Toronto 2 years ago. It was fantastic.
You could see echoes of the film in the book as well. It has a similarly poetic approach to refusal, which I appreciate.
I wanted to finish by saying thanks again to Sarah and Brian for engaging with the book, for joining me, for having a conversation about these themes that I think each in our own ways we think about a lot in our work and in our lives. So appreciate that. And I also want to say that I think I already said this in the beginning, but that you're kind of important inspirations for the work that I do, whether it's my writing, films, and so on. So yeah, it's been great to have you on here and to be able to have this conversation.
No, it's wonderful to talk to both of you. Thank you.
Yeah, and likewise, thank you for writing this book and giving us more fodder for thought, and again establishing that historical lineage and an opportunity to talk about and think about refusal in a more robust way. Also for this conversation, which was good fun. Thanks for letting me yap it up.
This has been a University of Minnesota Press production. The book Techno-Negative, A Long History of Refusing the Machine by Thomas DeKeyser is available from University of Minnesota Press. Thank you for listening.